Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode brings us to the wild and rugged mountains of western Montana and the beauty of Glacier National Park. The tragedy of our focus today happened against all odds with two separate bears to two completely different camps on the same night. In the dark of night on August 12, 1967, young lovers Julie Helgeson and Roy Ducat were basking in the magnificence of the heavenlies and developing a devotion for each other and the wilderness. They both worked for the Glacier Park Lodge, located only 21 miles from their campsite as the crow flies. Earlier in the day, they hitched a ride up the famous Going to the Sun Road along McDonald Lake and veered north at the Highline Trail. It is several miles hiking into the Granite Park Chalet, crisscrossing some of the most amazing views known to mankind. With their bedrolls laid out and camp set up, they settled in for a cozy, relaxing night, illuminated only by the stars as the moon was not out. They made camp only a quarter mile from the chalet because the chalet was booked full. Round midnight, Julie shook Roy awake, whispering, "There's a bear nearby. Don't move." The bear meandered around the terrified couple and approached aggressively. It immediately attacked Roy as he was in his sleeping bag. The bag may have offered very little protection given the lethal weapons the bear possessed, but it was all the protection Roy had. Powerful Grizzly clasped its jaws on Roy's sleeping bag and ragdolled it, throwing Roy a few yards away onto his face. Before he could gather his senses, the bear was on his back, attacking him with its claws and jaws. It bit his back twice and bit his leg once. He soon remembered the instructions on what to do in a bear confrontation. He decided to play dead, and the bear stopped mauling him. After mauling Roy, the bear turned its attention to Julie. Julie screamed out, "It hurts! Somebody help us!" as the bear savaged her. Screaming and terrified, Julie was dragged into the nearby forest by the powerful brown bear. Roy initially ran down the hill to their equipment to try to scare the bear off with a camera flash bulb, but couldn't find it. His left arm had been bitten and clawed badly, and he started to realize the extent of his injuries. He next decided to run back up the mountain to the chalet to try to find help. Just outside of the chalet, he found Don Gullett sleeping under the stars the same way he and Julie were. Roy violently shook Don to consciousness and stuttered the details to the groggy man. The chalet occupants were awakened by Julie's screams as well as the noise Don and Roy were making. Concerned people started poking out of the doors and windows of the chalet. Don decided to proceed up to the chalet, but Bob Klein, who was camping nearby, stopped him with an alternative. Bob pulled out a powerful flashlight and began signaling the chalet with the SOS signal in Morse code from a relative safety of a forestry cabin roof. Seeing the flashlight signal from the cabin deck, John Lipinski, who was a surgeon, yelled out, "What's the problem?" And the eerie response returned from the dark, "Bear!" Joan Devereaux was a naturalist staying at the chalet. She immediately radioed for assistance from authorities. Steve Pierre was a member of the local Kalispel Native American tribe and was recruited into assistance. Pierre agreed to take a group to the site in the dark during a bear attack. Drawing from the wisdom of his grandfather, Pierre grabbed a galvanized steel water basin and filled it with wood. The men would use it as a torch and light to keep the bears at bay as they approached the attack scene. The men set out down the trail as if participating in some ceremonial light-bearing ritual. Bert Gildart was a forest ranger doing road patrol when Devereaux's emergency assistance request cracked across his radio. Bert immediately contacted headquarters and relayed medical needs and information to Gary Bunny, who was a fire control officer working on wildfires in the area. The authorities then contacted helicopter pilot John Westover. Now, Westover was not just some ordinary helicopter pilot. John was the personal pilot for a general during the Vietnam War, as well as a combat pilot. He was renowned for his bravery and guts, but flying through the smoke-filled mountains under the curtain of the dark of night would be new territory for the aviation fanatic. Back at the chalet, Devereaux prepped an impromptu emergency helipad. Despite Roy's pleas for the group to find Julie, Devereaux instructed them to wait for a ranger with a rifle. Father Connolly and other chalet occupants set to work on the landing pad and gathered flashlights to signal the helicopter with. Bunny and Westover jumped into the copter and navigated their way toward the chalet using the absence of stars to locate mountains. Bunny and Westover jumped into the copter and navigated their way toward the chalet using the absence of stars to locate mountains. The night was too dark to see anything else. Bunny did his best to use the red light from the instrumentation panel to read a topographical map, and Westover flew by instinct since the copter had no gauges for him to use. In an overzealous attempt to assist the pilot, people on the ground lit up the plexiglass dome of the copter, temporarily blocking what little visibility Westover had. His experience and brashness guided the copter to a safe landing on the improvised helipad at the chalet. Westover landed a helicopter with no instrumentation by firelight adjacent to a sheer cliff. Meanwhile, Pierre and his small cohort had found a faint blood trail. They also found a personal item of Julie's on the same path. The group started yelling Julie's name, and somehow faintly she responded, "It hurts." The bear had stripped her of her clothes, and she had several puncture wounds on her back where the bear had gripped her in its jaws. She was terribly mauled, and had scratches and bite marks all over her body. She asked her rescuers to hold her hand, and they did. The rescue crew built an impromptu litter and carried her back to the chalet. There she was given emergency medical care. Lipinski and assistants tried to save her, but soon realized she had lost too much blood. Father Connolly said the Lord's Prayer with her as she slipped away at 4:13 a.m. of August 13th. Julie was the first fatality from bear attack in Glacier National Park's history, but she would not be the last. Approximately 4 hours after the first attack, and about 8 miles away, 5 employees of nearby McDonald Lodge had settled into their beds for the evening after spending the day hiking and enjoying their surroundings. The party included Paul Dunn, Michelle Coons, as well as brothers Ray and Ron Nelson. As the campers relaxed around the campsite, a gigantic silver grizzly bear crossed a nearby log jam, which was a typical travel route for the bears. The bear had an immense hump of muscle on his shoulders and was brazen in his attitude. The bear raided their food stores and departed back the same way it came. The group hastily relocated to camp down the shore to avoid another confrontation with the giant bear. The campers built up a fire with a log bulwark and reclined for the night. The giant bear did return briefly to eat a package of cookies the group left out on a log, then departed. The bear sporadically returned to woof and puff at the campers from the dark. The terrorized campers lay still, hoping that playing dead would prevent any further interactions. Paul Dunn could hear the heaving breaths of the giant bear and silently resented his malfunctioning zipper on his sleeping bag. The hungry Bruin clamped its mouth onto the sleeping bag and the shirt of Paul, which sent the man scurrying into the brush and up a nearby tree. He shouted warnings to the other campers. Paul instructed his fellow campers to run and stop playing dead. Each time one of the campers sprung from their sleeping bags to disappear into the darkness, it would startle the bear, but only temporarily, as he would come right back to investigate again. The others did run, but a terrified Michelle continued to play dead in her sleeping bag. The bear aggressively examined the best way to get to Michelle and ended up sticking its massive head into her bag and pulled her out by her arm. The onlookers heard Michelle say, "He's got my arm," followed by, "Oh my God, I'm dead." The wait was oppressive as the campers wondered about the actual fate of Michelle. Paul yelled at the others and quickly climbed down and rejoined the group on the lake shoreline. Each of them climbed a tree and waited tensely until dawn and the relief the light would bring. At that point, they climbed down from the safety of the trees and briskly hiked over Howe Ridge to the McDonald Lake Ranger Station. Along the way, their emotions meandered and some of them were overwhelmed at various points. Ranger Leonard Landa was on duty at the ranger station when the distraught group arrived. Landa had overheard the radio chatter about the bear attack near the chalet a few hours before and had initially confused the group's statements. He soon realized that they were talking about a completely different attack and armed himself to go to Trout Lake. He recruited the 3 men to accompany him. They bravely obliged. Ranger Gildart arrived at the station and immediately set out on pursuit of the group to assist as well. Upon arriving at Trout Lake, the rescue team found a fisherman who joined them. Paul and Ron and Ray located the attack scene and told the armed rangers where they saw the bear drag Michelle up the mountain. By now, Westover had received the radio call about the attack at Trout Lake and jumped back into his helicopter to assist there. He located an acceptable place to land and met up with the other men. The search party followed a drag trail littered with blood and tissue, but eventually found her body. The bear had mutilated and mauled her so terribly that many of the men showed signs of shock at the sight. Michelle's corpse was recovered and armed rangers returned to Trout Lake. A small group of rangers then cleared the area of any visitors and planted baits to try to lure the brown bear into range to dispatch it for good. They waited over the baits for several hours until shortly before dusk, then made their way to the Arrow Lake shelter cabin. They were relieved to get inside to safety and rest for the evening. In the morning, Park Ranger Gildart stepped out of the door into the morning air. Suddenly, in the bed of Camas Creek, just over 40 feet from him, the bear they were searching for was staring staring at him. The bear peeked above the foliage and then disappeared briefly. Then it stood on its hind legs to get a better view. Gildart yelled at the others in the cabin to bring the rifle, as the bear was right next to them. The bear started to approach the men, but these were not innocent teenagers naively enjoying the wilderness. The armed men took steady aim and killed the bear. The authorities flew in a biologist to perform a necropsy on the dead bear. The dead bear was dissected, and inside they found a clump of blonde hair. Authorities assigned several armed rangers to shoot any bear that came to the trash dumps near the chalet or anywhere near Trout Lake. They found and killed 4 bears within a day or so. The male bear shot at Trout Lake was emaciated despite having a gigantic frame, indicating it was having difficulty finding natural food. It also had broken glass embedded in its gums and was believed to be in excruciating pain. Among the bears killed was a sow with 2 cubs. She was killed near the chalet garbage dump. The sow had blood on her claws and was believed to be the bear that killed Helgeson. The necropsy revealed that she had an injury to the pad on one of her hind feet, probably due to stepping on broken glass or a tin can at the dump site. One of her cubs had his jaw shattered by a shot from one of the rangers, but miraculously lived through the winter, only to die the following year. An investigation revealed that the Granite Peak Chalet had an incinerator installed the prior year, but the staff decided not to use it, opting instead to dump their trash in a pit. The bears would come and search for food in the trash, and that would bring tourists who wanted to watch the bears. It was also noted that visitors to Kelly's camp had reported problems with the male bear shot at Trout Lake. He was noted to behave aggressively and scavenging at their camp dump site. The report also indicated that there were all sorts of wrappers and trash at Trout Lake, which apparently pulled the boar away from Kelly's camp to Trout Lake. Rangers removed 20 bags of trash from the Trout Lake campground. This account was memorialized in the PBS documentary Night of the Grizzlies and by a book of the same name by author Jack Olson. Authorities estimate that a single fatal bear attack would have the odds of 1 in a million, while the odds of 2 different bears attacking 2 different people in nearby locations would be incalculable. Back to scary bear attacks. Today's episode takes us to the east side of the world-renowned Yellowstone National Park, which straddles the borders of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Yellowstone National Park features some of the most well-preserved natural ecosystems remaining in the modern world. The area is crowded with bison, moose, black and brown bear, wolves, and cougar, not to mention the plentiful deer, elk, and antelope. Each of these species offer their own degree of beauty and danger. Brian Matayoshi from Torrance, California was 57 years old and had recently retired as a pharmacist. Brian and his wife Marilyn were on their 4th visit to Yellowstone National Park and about halfway through their planned 3-week trip. The date was July 6th of 2011 and the time was around 11 a.m. The couple was approximately 1.5 kilometers down the Wapiti Lake Trail. They encountered a fellow hiker who allowed them to use his binoculars to view a sow grizzly and her 2 cubs from about 500 yards, an appropriate distance to view such dangerous predators. The couple had never spotted a bear in their previous visits, so this was a special treat for them. They took photos and continued down the trail. They had no idea that the bears they just photographed would be only 20 minutes from an appointment with destiny which would change each of their lives. The pair traveled down the trail about a quarter of a mile when they were fogged with a swarm of mosquitoes and decided to turn back the way they came. As they approached the area they previously saw the sow and cubs, they noticed the trio of bears was now a mere 100 yards from the trail they were on. Brian and Marilyn navigated a dense stand of lodgepole pine only to emerge just across from a grassy meadow from the bears. The sow bear, now in protection mode, trotted toward the couple, inducing instant panic. Brian turned toward Marilyn and yelled, "Run!" They had no bear spray nor a firearm to fall back on, so they immediately began running away and yelling as the sow and cubs pursued out of curiosity or potentially another motive. As Brian and Marilyn entered the trailhead, they had passed signs warning of bear activity in the area and reminding hikers and photographers to lay down and play dead if involved in a confrontation with a bear, and to use bear spray as a last resort. Now the sow was closing in on them, and they had forgotten any instruction as they were convinced that they were in extreme danger. Most people consciously know that they cannot outrun a bear, but once fear dominates the mind, options become limited and panic prevails. The sow caught Brian about 270 yards into the pursuit and tackled him to the ground. Marilyn hid behind a fallen tree and tried to envision herself anywhere else but where she was. She lifted her head just in time to see the bear punch Brian in the head and knock him down again. Witnesses a few hundred yards away indicated Brian made animal sounds while being attacked, possibly in an attempt to frighten the bear or in mimicry of his attacker. The cubs were reportedly growling as they watched their mom bite and claw Brian, according to Marilyn. The sow spent a few minutes biting and clawing Brian's body as he fought her attack fruitlessly before Marilyn rose to her knees to adjust her camera position. She had laid on it as she collapsed behind the log and was now moving it from, protruding into her side. The sow trotted over to Marilyn, who had begun to play dead by falling face first onto the ground. The sow picked Marilyn up by her backpack and slammed her into the ground to see if there was a reaction. The woman remained still, and the sow broke off the attack. It seemed as if the bear had to impart a final bit of intimidation to the woman before feeling confident enough to leave safely with her cubs. Marilyn quickly ran to Brian's side and improvised a tourniquet to Brian's wounded knee from a jacket. Brian released one last deep breath and was still. His life had ebbed as she tried to save him. He was motionless and unresponsive when a hiker in the area who was a trauma surgeon called 911. He was positioned just a few hundred yards away and somehow managed to get signal enough for the call, while Marilyn's 21 attempts failed. Authorities declined to perform an autopsy on Brian as his fatal injuries were obvious. He had a large gash and hematoma on his forehead from the blunt force trauma of the bear's punch. His femoral artery was also severed from the bite on his knee, causing rapid insanguination. The park authorities concluded the uncollared and untagged sow was acting defensively and had no previous acts of aggression toward humans, so they would not euthanize her nor her cubs. The Yellowstone National Park area is reported to be home to about 600 grizzly bears. The aggravating conditions regarding this incident included a deeper-than-normal snowpack, which forced the bears into lower elevations for browse, as well as pushing brown bears out of Yellowstone National Park into lower elevations surrounding the park. This incident resulted in the first bear attack fatality in Yellowstone National Park in 25 years. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. In today's episode, we travel back to Yellowstone National Park. Why, you ask? Well, this case is linked to the Brian Matsuoshi attack we posted last time in a very curious way. As we've discussed in our prior videos, Yellowstone National Park is seated on the world's largest batholith volcano, which is overdue for an eruption. The area is riddled with earthquakes several times a year, and it is this fact that creates its unique geography and marvels. Visitors from around the world travel here during when the park is open to view the sights such as Old Faithful Geyser, the Upper Geyser Basin, Morning Glory Pool, mud volcanoes, and the wildlife-strewn Lamar Valley. These are only a few of the attractions at the park, many of which can and do claim your life if you are not careful. John Wallace was a 59-year-old man from Chassell, Michigan. He visited Yellowstone National Park the last weeks of August of 2011 and basked in the warm weather and majestic sights at every turn. Since the park doesn't allow firearms and John neglected to purchase bear spray, he was vulnerable but still excited to see the park. John had sat through a safety lecture and announced that he didn't need the class because he was a grizzly bear expert. On August 25th, John struck out at around 7:30 a.m. by himself on the Mary Mountain Trail hike, passing many grizzly bear warning signs on his way. This trail is a known grizzly bear hotspot and is closed from March to June each year due to bears feeding on winter-killed bison. John enjoyed hiking alone, and it isn't uncommon for hikers to traverse the trails alone or at least share them with the local wildlife. John's friends and family considered him a very experienced backcountry traveler and knowledgeable about hiking safety. They also stated that he loved Yellowstone and that he felt like he was in heaven whenever he visited. John hiked and inhaled the pure mountain air for about 5 miles and came upon a stand of lodgepole pines overlooking a small meadow. He decided to sit down for a snack and refreshments. He carefully dug around in his day pack for his snack and pulled out a fruit drink and then relaxed for a break. The trail is not extremely difficult, but it has its rewards in the solitude nature offers to aficionados. John was surrounded by grass on the edge of a meadow and felt at ease. Unbeknownst to John, he was positioned within a few hundred yards of 2 winter-killed bison carcasses that area bears were feeding from. He suddenly heard an approaching animal and probably expected an elk or a bison, both common sights in the area. The animal was a grizzly bear, and yet worse, a sow with a single cub. He hurried to his feet as the bears approached casually. He made some noise and tried to frighten the bears off, but they stared at him and continued their stalk. The evidence indicates that the sow began to attack John and apparently took him to the ground. John used his right forearm to try to fend off her jaws by putting it between the sow and him. That only gave her a handle from which to control him. She bit him several times on his hand and arm, as well as clawed him all over his upper body. As he rolled over to protect his vital areas, she bit and clawed him in the back as well. The attack took some time to kill the man before the bear and her cub began feeding on the man's corpse. The bears ate their fill from John's corpse and resumed browsing for whitebark pine nuts, another food source that draws them to the higher elevation of the trail. The next day, a young lady and her father were hiking up the Mary Mountain Trail when she noticed some birds circling an area just before the trees converged on the trail ahead. She carefully climbed over a tree which fell across the trail and saw a plastic bottle with pink fluid in it on the ground. She looked around and saw what she thought was a backpack, and as she approached, she saw boots and legs laying across the trail. The upper body was covered with duff and dirt. John's refreshments and lunch container, along with his rain jacket, were sitting nearby. They had found what remained of John Wallace. Authorities were notified and John's remains were recovered. They collected the tracks of the bears at the attack scene and noticed a pair of tracks from a sow and a cub had blood in their tracks, John's blood. The authorities set up traps to try to collect DNA samples from the local bear population to track down the bears involved in John's attack. After catching and sampling DNA from several bears in the area, the bears were released with radio collars until the test results were returned. The plan was to use the collars to locate any bears of interest. Several weeks later, a sow and her cubs were captured, and she was identified as the bear that was present at John's mauling scene. The track identifiers taken from the attack scene matched this sow and one of her cubs. The 250-pound sow was euthanized on October 2, 2011, and the cubs were placed with the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center in West Yellowstone, Montana. This sow was also the bear tagged and responsible for the horrible bear attack a month earlier on Brian Matayoshi.